Hello and welcome back. So in today's video, this is where you're going to find some more value plays. In the previous video, we went over forwards who had underperformed their 5-year average and could be considered buy low options and some decent value for your fantasy team. Today we do the same, but for defensemen. So if you haven't already watched the defenseman overdraft video, feel free to check that one out as well, as one of the takeaways was that not all of those defensemen are bad picks, but some may get overdrafted based on their production from last year. But there are still some value plays that can be found on that other list as well, so you might want to check out that video, and I've linked that in the description below. But for today, just a quick recap. This channel and this draft strategy is all about finding and extracting value. One way to do that is to look at players who overproduced and underproduced last year and make a reasonable guess as to why that was, and try to determine who will be due for a bounce back season or a regression season. In the previous videos, we were looking at regression candidates, but in this one, we'll be looking specifically for value defensemen. What exactly are we looking for? So in this video, despite that a lot of these defensemen are going to be considered value plays and buy low options, they don't all necessarily always pan out, despite picking the right guy at the right time. So if you found the right guy on this list at the right time in the draft, it still may not help your team win. You need to pair this with some sort of strategy for drafting defensemen, as the elite ones usually are gone pretty early in the draft. If you're looking at the data without regard for the overall plan or without a strategy, maybe take a step back and watch my rule number 2 video for drafting defensemen. That's in the description below as well, and there's a playlist with all of the rules that I've put together for the data draft strategy. So if you don't have a strategy yet for your fantasy draft, you can check that out as well. But that's going to factor into some of these guys and where they will fit in your strategy and with your draft. You want to make sure that you're keeping in mind the strategy when you're looking at these candidates. So the data, if you've been watching the last couple of videos, nothing is new here in terms of this is a data set from a 5-year point per game average compared with the player's point per game average from last season. If a player hadn't played all 5 seasons, the average was calculated from the available data. And for this video, the threshold to be listed here was 0.4 points per game average last year, which somewhat mirrors fantasy relevance, as it's about 50% or a little bit more than 50% lower than the highest point per game average defenseman last year. And as we look at this chart, the first couple things that we notice here are some interesting files at the top with Dougie Hamilton and Tyson Barrie. So with Hamilton, 0.48 point per game last year, usually a 0.64 point per game average over the last 5 years. And he's kind of all over the place over the past number of years. 0.53, 0.47, 0.85, 0.76, and then a 0.48. You'll probably notice, I believe the first 2 years on that set were with Calgary. Then the 0.85, 0.76 years were in Carolina. And then last year, 0.48 in New Jersey. But he's never been above a point per game average, so that may deter some of you from thinking of him as an absolute elite defenseman. But then again, not many of them over the past number of years have hit a point per game average, although it's been trending in that direction. But Hamilton shoots the puck a lot, so 3.1 shots per game last year, 3.29, 3.15, 3.16, 3.27, and then the 3.17 last year. So he's always basically over 3 shots a game, and that can definitely help you if you're trying to corner the market on shots. Last year, he was only 0.12 power play points per game last year, but usually his last really good season in Carolina, he was a 0.32 power play point per game guy. If you don't know anything about that metric, basically, if you're at or around a 0.3, that's going to give you somewhere in the low 20s for power play points on the season, and that's pretty fantasy relevant. One of the elite guys will probably have somewhere in that range. The 0.3 or above is typically a really good number for a defenseman. But he only had that production in Carolina, so it's interesting to see if he'll be able to do it in New Jersey. Now, I happen to like a lot of their players this year. Playing with Jack Hughes on that power play, he'll probably rack up the points, and I could definitely see this being a good buy low candidate for that reason. But it is important to keep in mind 1.4 hits per game and 1.4 blocks per game, which is a little bit better than some of the other strictly offensive guys. So something to keep in the back of your mind there as well. Tyson Barrie, 0.28 power play points per game, so right around that 0.3 number. He had 21 power play points last year, and that's what we were talking about with that metric. That's kind of what that equates to. Usually 2.49 shots per game over the 5-year average. Last year he was about 2.0, so there is some room for improvement there. And obviously with him, his exposure to that Edmonton power play would be the main reason to pick him. But will he or Evan Bouchard take that power play spot? So if we look back at it, last year Bouchard only had 7 power play points and Barrie had 21. And if you look at the ice time, Barrie averaged 251 of power play time on ice. Bouchard averaged about 120. And in the playoffs, that got bumped a little bit more. So Barrie got 3 minutes per game, and Bouchard was at 1:50 per game on the power play. So there is a very real threat that Bouchard takes that power play spot. And if you're banking on that happening and you pass up on Barrie, it could be a nice little insurance policy to pick him up later in the draft or off the waiver wire, because Jay Woodcroft seems to prefer him. And it's another thing to note that it might not just be the coach that prefers him. Sometimes the forwards that are on that unit have some say in the matter, especially when the 2 of those forwards are the 2 best players in the league. And if they prefer Barrie, then Barrie's going to get the spot. So just something to think about if you're trying to decide between the 2 of them. But he could be another deep value play if you're looking at a power play quarterback. But there is a lot of risk baked in there just based on who's going to get that spot. So as we return to the list here, Mark Giordano, the next guy on this list, his 5-year average, this is, we're going to talk about this in a second, but his 5-year average includes his Norris Trophy season where he put up .94 points per game, which was 74 points in 78 games. And that was a one-off if I've ever seen one. So we were talking about in the overdraft video, looking for regression candidates. Typically, the guys we would look for that regression would be this exact file. So 0.46, 0.94, 0.51, 0.46, 0.46. So let's just imagine that this 0.94 was at the end of this set. That's exactly what you would look for. You would say to yourself, okay, he's around a 0.46 every year. And he had a 0.94 last year, so he's obviously due for regression. Well, unfortunately for this player, that 0.94 was much further back in his history, and then he did regress. So he regressed to a 0.51 and then went down a little bit further. So he's basically one of those players where his best years are behind him in terms of offensive production, and he is not likely to be picked for his offensive production. One thing that he could get picked for is blocks. He had 1.85 per game last season, but he only averaged 1 hit per game, so he's not really a stellar hits and blocks combo guy, as we discovered and discussed in the hits and blocks video. So he's probably not the guy to use for that strategy, but if you're just looking for blocks, he could still be relevant. Now, the next guy on that list was Pietrangelo. He's a fairly well-rounded defenseman, as I came to find doing this research. His 5-year point per game is a .62 average, so he's a little bit below that last season, but he is goal and shot heavy, so he basically averages 13 to 16 goals a year. If you look at the numbers, this is how they break down over the past 5, 0.19, 0.18, 0.22, 0.17, 0.16. Very consistent, all in that same 13 to 16 goal range, which is really good. It's usually maybe a top 5, top 7 goal-scoring defenseman would be in this range. Last year, Makar hit 28, which is insane, and he'll probably be the number 1 guy for that again. But Pietrangelo does score some goals, and he does shoot the puck. So he had 2.83 shots per game last season, and he had 2.83 shots per game average over the past 5. And in that 5-year span, he's gone over 3 shots a game twice. And both of those times that he went over, I believe he was with Vegas. If not, at least one of those times he was with Vegas. So he does shoot the puck a lot. He does get goals a lot. He still puts up a decent amount of points. And then on top of that, he gets 2.05 blocks per game, which would put him in the top 10th percentile for blocks. So the only question mark in his file is his power play production and time. So last year, he averaged 0.16 power play points per game, which was about 13 power play points, which obviously is about half of what you would want. Normally, in a power play quarterback defenseman, you'd want that 0.3 number, which would give you about 20 power play points. If you look at Theodore and Pietrangelo's files, they're remarkably similar. So Theodore averages 0.15 goals per game, and around a .61 points per game over the last 5 years. So very similar. They both shoot a ton. Theodore had 2.62 shots per game last year, usually in that 2.73 range, and he had .15 power play points per game and 12 power play points as well. So they're right in the same range for basically every category. So the difference between these two D is basically which one of these two guys Bruce Cassidy is going to favor on that top power play unit. And my hunch is that it comes down to handedness. So Pietrangelo is a right shot guy. Theodore's a left shot guy. I would imagine they would want the right shot guy feeding pucks to Jack Eichel in that Ovechkin office spot on the power play. But I wouldn't bank on that because both of these guys are very good at what they do, and they could either one of them could be used for the power play on the top unit. So I would monitor what happens in training camp and adjust based on that. And if you see one of them go really high, you can maybe pick the other one up deeper and still gain some exposure to a lot of the same stat and category coverages that you're looking at. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. In terms of power play quarterbacks, Brent Burns is one of these guys who used to be one of the best, used to be the number one guy. In fact, one of these years, that 1.01 point per game, he was the highest offensive producing defenseman that season. But obviously this was his prime. So he's trended downward over the past couple seasons, but he still has a .72 point per game average, and he was relatively close to that last year with 54 points in 82 games. So he's trended down, but he did basically that thing that we mentioned before where he was here, he bounced down to .51, but then came back with a nice bounce back season. In addition to that, his shots per game numbers have trended down over the last 5 years. So he used to be one of the best at this category as well. 4 shots per game, 3.65, 3.21, 2.46, 2.47. But he just went and got traded to the 9th highest volume shooting team in the league in the Carolina Hurricanes. And if my memory serves me correct, a couple years ago, they were number 1 in that category. And typically Carolina likes to just shoot the puck for any reason. They'll dump the puck by just throwing it on net and starting their forecheck that way, which could help Burns' shot numbers. Another thing to keep in mind, he's last year he was a .22 power play point per game guy, which is good. His highest totals were above that .3 number, though, and that was when he was in his prime in San Jose. And if you look at the team that he's coming to, last year their power play quarterback was Tony DeAngelo, who put up 51 points in 64 games and 20 power play points. So he had a .31 power play points per game average. And then that same year, Tony DeAngelo put up his highest shot per game numbers over the last 5. And he was drafted at ADP 183, according to FantasySP.com. So last year you could have got Tony DeAngelo pretty late, and he was an elite power play quarterback. If that same phenomenon happens with Brent Burns, which I doubt it will, he could be excellent value if you can get him in that 180 range. If you can get him above 100, that's still really good value. I would say anything past the 5th round would be good value for this guy because a lot of people are going to be baking into his file the fact that he's going to a really good team. In addition to that, he still averages 1.8 blocks per game, which is very good. It's probably in the top 25th percentile. Just maybe not one of the elite blockers, but that might change with a different role on a new team. So something to keep in mind if you're looking at Brent Burns. The next guy lower on that list was Torey Krug. Usually he's a solid fantasy option. His 5-year average point per game is .74, so pretty good. Last year didn't really underperform that much, but a little bit there. His main problem is he doesn't stay healthy. So you look at the games played, never really come close. I mean, this 76 games, that's with Boston a couple of years ago. But he's basically in that 60 range, 64, 61, 51, 64. This 51 games was in a smaller sample size season, so he might have been closer to an 82 game pace. But if he can stay healthy, he might be a good value option. If you look at his points per game over the past 5 seasons, these first 3 numbers are with Boston. The last 2 are with St. Louis, or maybe the last one is with St. Louis. I'm not 100% sure. Somebody can check me on that. But if you look at it, he did, drop considerably here, but then bounced up a little bit. So he could be trending in the right direction, finally. And if he can stay healthy, the thing that you want to draft him for is his power play points per game. That .29, right around that .3 number, 19 power play points last year. and you're getting exposure to the number 2 power play in the league last year. St. Louis was running at about 27%, and they pretty much are bringing back the exact same team. So he's a guy that could get you excellent power play exposure to a really good team. The only question I had was whether or not he would keep that spot, because Justin Falk had 16 goals on the season last year. But Falk didn't have a lot of power play production, and I would assume that Krug is going to start there for the upcoming season. The next guy on this list was Neal Pionk. So Pionk usually, a lot of people, including myself, have been pleasantly surprised with how well he's played in Winnipeg, but he's just not a great fantasy option. Never scored more than 6 goals in a season, usually averages around a half a point per game. You'd prefer better. And he underperformed last year. And then on top of that, he doesn't shoot the puck a ton. So he's at 1.81 shots per game. And he's been trending downward in his power play point production, but not just trending downward. If you look at this is another case of where he was due for a regression. You can see one of these numbers is not like the other. That .35 season, that's probably what makes people think of him as a power play guy for fantasy, but that was a one-off. Every other year he's been in this basic channel between 0.15 and 0.18 power play points per game. So he's not that power play guy that people think he is. In fact, Josh Morrissey was probably a better own last year, probably a better draft pick last year. But the one thing he does do well is hit. 2.4 hits per game. And that's a little bit surprising, just given the fact that he's a smaller defenseman. 1.1 blocks per game. That's also pretty good, but could be a little bit better. But he could be a decent D3 or D4 candidate depending on which categories you're going to try to cover with that positioning. And then if we could just take a look at the rest of the guys all as one. As you can see, the guys at the top of this list are more primed for a breakout year or a bounce back year. The guys at the bottom are a lot closer to their averages. You can't really see it down here, but Jacob Chychrun basically hit his average right on the money. Karlsson was really close to that. So let's just cover a couple of these guys really quickly. Matthias Ekholm isn't really a fantasy option. So 1.03 hits, 1.24 blocks per game, nothing there. No real power play production either. 1.9 shots per game is okay, but 0.4 points per game average isn't really ownable, nor is his 0.46 5-year point per game average. The only thing I would recommend him for is maybe plus minus, because I'm pretty high on that Nashville defense with him, with Yossi, with McDonough, and Dante Fabro. That's an excellent top 4. They will probably be given a bump for their plus minus numbers. You could mine some value for that stat there, but if your defenseman is only giving you one category, that's not a good look, so he's probably not fantasy relevant there. If you look at John Klingberg and you're watching this video and you do have plus minus in your league, just skip ahead, because John Klingberg is not your guy. If you look at his plus minus for the last 5 seasons, he was a plus 10, plus 6, minus 10, minus 15, minus 28. So he's been trending horribly in the wrong direction. He does put up points. So he's 0.81, 0.70, 0.55, 0.67, 0.63 points per game average across the last 5. And his power play production is pretty good at a 0.27. So right around that 20 power play point per game pace. Power play point per season pace. He doesn't shoot the puck a ton, 1.87 shots per game. Doesn't hit at all, doesn't block shots. So really, he's 1 or 2 categories for you, and that would be assists and power play points, maybe some points in general. But he could be a deeper value play if you're looking at that. Now, Matt Dumba, in a previous video, I mentioned a crazy stat that Dumba had the highest goal per game season over anyone over the last 5 years. And that season, he had 12 goals in 32 games, which was a .375 goal per game average, which is insane. That was 18-19, and he didn't stay healthy that year, so that could explain some of that. And he hasn't really come close to that since then. Half a point per game guy, not overly exciting, but he does average 2 shots, 2 hits exactly, and 1.4 blocks per game. So he could be used in that D3, D4 role, depending on your strategy there. And then the last guy I wanted to talk about, Erik Karlsson, 0.71 point per game average over the last 5 years. If you look at his production, 0.2 goals per game, that was 10 goals last year, And his point production, he did that same type of bounce thing. So he had a .87, a .84, a .71, then he dropped to a .42, and then back up to a .7. So he is primed for a breakout season. And he does shoot the puck. He had 2.4 shots per game, which is really good. 0.2 power play points per game, so he's been effective on the power play. And this year he will probably get more opportunity as Brent Burns just got shipped off. Again, he's probably not a good idea for fantasy players with plus minus, and he doesn't get a lot of hits or blocks either, so not a good D3 according to my hits and blocks video. But if you're going for a power play guy for your D3, he could be a good option. And then just a last summary, as you can probably hear my son waking up in the background. That's a real baby screaming, not your imagination. Some of these files are unownable due to their lack of point production, the lack of power play time, or a decline in their numbers with age, as we saw with Giordano. The best options from this list are all ideally power play quarterbacks on a really good power play. So Hamilton, Barrie, if he gets that spot, Pietrangelo or Theodore, whoever gets that spot, Burns, Krug, and Klingberg are the best options there for the power play numbers. Now, the big thing that I wanted to try to remind you all across the way here, you need to remember to follow a strategy when drafting defensemen, and you can use this data to inform who to pick, but it's not going to tell you exactly what you need in terms of category coverage or if you're in a points league trying to maximize point value. So make sure that you do have a strategy when you're drafting. And again, if you don't have a strategy, I have the strategy for you. There's a playlist on my channel, and you can find all the links for all the different rules to that strategy in the description below. But I want to thank you again for paying attention. I'm going to go attend to my son finally and stop torturing him. But thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.